Welcome back, everyone. I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Ghassan Mkhayber, Mr. Zisoon, Dr. Georgios Dimitropoulos, and Mr. Josh Martin to take their seats on stage, and welcome Mr. Daniel Shepard, member of Nudge Lebanon's Board of Trustees and former member of the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team, to moderate this panel titled Compliance and Rule of Law, Rethinking Government Services Delivery Through a Behavioral Lens.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming back after a nice coffee break. So this panel hopefully will dig in a bit deeper, specifically around how we can use behavioral insights to inform government service delivery, rule of law, good governance, and so forth. And we kind of want to touch on three themes, part of which have been covered in previous sessions, but to go a bit further and more specifically. One is to touch again on how what we're doing with the application of behavioral insights has some new elements, some more specific elements. We have a clear idea perhaps now about how we can influence particular individuals or group behavior. But there's also some continuity with the past, which we've already heard. So we'll have some reflections from our brilliant panel here about that sort of continuity and change. We'll also have some reflections on specific examples to make it quite practical, what we're talking about, and to give the audience something to react to. And hopefully, time bearing, we'll be able to speak a little bit about these questions of sustainability and scalability after pilots, which might be a bit shorter. So I'm very honored to be on a great panel with the four of these gentlemen here. So we have His Excellency Ghassan Mkhayber, who's a current MP of the Lebanese Parliament, and he is also a member on the Board of Trustees of Nudge Lebanon. We have Zisoon, who's joining us again from the previous panel. He's a member of BIT, Director of Employment, Skills, and Labor, as you all well know now. Josh is also joining us. Josh is a Vice President at Ideas 42, has a wealth of experience in the States, but also globally, so he'll speak a bit about that experience with Ideas 42. And then we have Georgios Dimitropoulos, who's joining us, who's the founder of Nudge Greece, and also is a professor at HBKU in Doha. So we're very happy to have all these gentlemen here, and I'm very interested to hear what they have to say, their reflections. So without further ado, we'll jump into it. I'll split it a bit differently in the past with kind of two question sections, so get ready with your questions from the audience. So to start things off, if you guys don't mind, Z, to speak a little bit about not just what's the continuity and what's new about behavioral insights, but also with your experience at BIT, what's kind of special or different about doing this work at a national or a local level, and where are kind of those sweet spots?
Thank you. Thanks, Daniel. So I think from our side, you mind if I just grab the clicker if somebody has that around for the slides? No? Sorry. Thanks, Dan. Cheers. Just going to open my one. While we do that, maybe I'll answer the second part of it. I think the point on the national versus the local one, again, it's an interesting challenge that we have at BIT, because I think on the one hand, on the national scale side of things, obviously you have the potential for large social impact. You have the potential to introduce interventions that have an impact in multi-jurisdictional kind of ways. And that's fantastic, but with that comes all sorts of limitations. Often national governments around the world are actually that one step removed from the citizen itself. So they rely on other state or provincial governments or municipalities to introduce a lot of the implementation side of government policy. And so while the national sort of side does have that temptation of being able to have that broad social impact and potentially change national regulation in order to be more behavior informed, there is that sort of limitation in terms of being able to sort of shift forms, shift letters, and genuinely look at the human behavior in terms of an interaction with a particular policy lever or initiative. And there's also the challenge, obviously, on the national level politically. No doubt it's the case here in Lebanon, but around the world as well. National politics is always charged with different opinions and different sort of like policy interests. And so being able to run projects without running into political roadblocks left, right, and centre can be particularly challenging as well. But then I think the reverse also obviously applies then to the local side of things, where where you're closer to the citizen and closer to that interaction and be able to change some of the public services at that forefront, which is fantastic. But again, the challenge then becomes, well, if you can have an impact in one local municipality area, will that necessarily be able to translate to the other municipality areas, because often systems are different, whether technologically, processes are different as well, and so then just because you get the one win in one municipality doesn't necessarily mean it's able to easily translate towards the others. And also sometimes it requires that national push, right? So changes in legislation, obviously behavioural reform changes legislation are required, and so sometimes at that local level that's not possible. But then I thought through my slides I'd show just a bit of an evolution around some of the thinking around behavioural intervention. So I don't know whether you can see some of the detail of it. Often it can be as simple as like the communication changes that's been done in the past, and we've done many trials with that, around that, and no doubt some of our partners on the stage here and in previous panels as well. This is one example of a letter from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Again, it's a letter, if you look at the detail on there, it says a tax health plan. It kind of goes into the history of the tax health plan to the individual, which I think from behavioural insights perspective, you do question the fact, is this really necessary? I don't know how much detail you can actually see on the big screen itself when you go through it. You can't actually realise what the intention of this letter is. Even if you've finished the first page, even if you get to the end of the letter, often we use this as an exercise when we do workshops right now to think about how behavioural insights can play a role. But essentially what this letter is basically getting doctors and dentists to file their tax returns and get them to pay their tax. Again, it's quite a simple statement, but for some reason in 1.5 pages, government has not been able to communicate that. And so it's just a simple example of the initial behavioural insights work a lot of the team has been doing around the world and with local governments as well as national governments. But I think the second example that I want to show is like the evolution beyond that. It's not just about one single point communications, but thinking about whole interactions and processes that can be informed by behavioural science as well. So this next slide is just a trial that we've done a number of years ago now, but I thought it was a good example to illustrate, well, the way that we're thinking about behavioural insights isn't necessarily just one simple change to one letter or one form of communication. It can be, and is necessarily so, involving changing whole interactions with citizens, changing whole experiences. And so with this particular trial and intervention, we looked at how a job seeker in the UK interacts with the government in terms of the support they receive, but then also the benefits, financial welfare support payments they get as well. And so we ran an initial trial looking at, well, can you not just change the one form that's associated with it, but can you change how an individual feels about the whole experience? Can you change like the dynamics of that relationship using behavioural science? And a couple of examples of the, I think, nudges we pulled together includes things like, first of all, changing how the job centre advisor, who is the government advisor there working with the citizen, basically mentioned what the experience would be like. Traditionally, under the traditional experience, they often identify that, oh, we're going to support you through this process, I'm going to guide you through these forms, and often it was really focused on the process of the welfare payment and some of the process around job seeking, but the dynamic was really about the welfare payment itself rather than actually finding employment. And so it involved, I guess, creating prompts throughout the actual interaction for the job centre advisor to really prompt them to think about the employment part of it. And the other part was obviously around into things like implementation intentions and mental contrasting, which is a fancy way of saying getting the actual job seeker to make a plan and sort of identifying barriers that could potentially inhibit them from finding a job and really working with them to overcome that. And so it wasn't just one letter, it was a series of interventions throughout several interactions between the citizen and the government service itself in order to have an impact. We then went on to sort of roll this out and take it to scale, but I really wanted to talk about that briefly to go, well, on one side, there is the sort of single point nudge, but then in order to really address some deeper seated issues, you're going to have to look at interventions at multiple points throughout a service in order to really have that interaction. And I think more and more in terms of that continuity and change point that Daniel raised, we're going to have to think about intervention in that space rather than just those one-offs.
Thanks, Lee. That's brilliant. And we'll have a moment to reflect on these examples a little bit more in a second as well. Thank you very much for kicking us off. One quick question on that is just, what was your experience on these two interventions, or just in general, at the local versus national level as far as how receptive people were to the ideas of using these nudges?
That's a really good question. So I think let's focus on the job centre. On the real local level, it was really interesting to have the conversations with staff members. And like I know your team has done similar stuff when you were in SBST around the employment context and really spending time with job centre advisors. What was really interesting was to see how national government thought the interactions were like and what the standard operating principles were, when in fact what the situation and the reality on the ground was very different, and be able to sort of see that contrast. I remember a couple of members of the team spent months with the team really trying to see those experiences. And the first day we met with the job centre staff. They identified for us, well, this is how we do it, very much in line with the national policy that was written down in the standard operating principles. But after probably a week or so, a couple of weeks and a month, we started to let slip and got comfortable with us, go, actually, this is how we really do it. And so we don't really use this form. We usually fill this one after the meeting, or we usually do this much later. And so being able to see the contrast between what the national government is actually thinking is going on and at the local level, what's actually being practiced in terms of that implementation at that local level was really fascinating to see.
Super interesting. Thanks for that. So to zoom out a little bit, I think it's really interesting to think about how some of this work connects to other theories about good governance and about how we structure our laws. So we're very fortunate to have George here to reflect on how the use of behavioral insights connects to some of these socio-legal theories. And maybe also, if you want to go ahead, you can touch on a few examples as well.
Thank you very much, Daniel. In fact, thank you very much for the invitation as well. Many thanks to the whole Nudge Lebanon team and Fadi. I'm very happy to be here. In fact, I'm a lawyer by training. I teach law at HBKU Law School in Doha, in Qatar. And we started with Fadi Maki a couple of months ago a new course on law and behavioral public policy, teaching graduate law students behavioral law and economics, and actually, in fact, implementing a couple of experiments, in fact, over the course of a semester. Now, what I want to do now, as a first step, is try to contextualize a little bit nudging with traditional and some less traditional theories on the rule of law. Right? Nudging is about policy making, changing policies, and which means more often than not changing the law. Right? Changing the laws. The default rules are the primary example of this. Now, there is two main rule of law theories. There is the formal or formalistic rule of law theory that says that it is necessary for a legal framework that there is procedural safeguards, right, to protect citizens' rights. There is a substantive or a thick definition of the rule of law, and it's important to try to contextualize nudging with the rule of law, that says that the rule of law is not about rules, procedural rules as such, but about second-order principles. Every legal order or every rule needs to be following, a certain path, namely, respect principles of justice or of democracy or good governance or human rights. I think this is something that needs to be much more integrated into the theory of behavioral interventions and nudging. Now, these are the two principal theories that lawyers discuss about when it goes to government interventions and the rule of law. There is a third theory that, interestingly enough, comes from psychology, not cognitive psychology this time, but social psychology, namely procedural justice theory, that says a legal framework is legitimated if certain procedural safeguards are in place that involve people in the decision-making processes. It's mostly, a theory developed by Tom Tyler, a social psychologist and a lawyer from Yale Law School, that says that for every legal environment, it's necessary to have 4 elements, namely neutrality, voice for people that participate in the decision-making process to have the chance to express themselves. A third, trustworthiness, that the decisions are made within an environment of trustworthiness, and courtesy and respect, that everybody needs to feel that they are respected in the decision-making process. Now, let me try to contextualize this a little bit with behavioral interventions and nudging. Well, nudges and other behavioral interventions sit relatively uneasily with these traditional and less traditional definitions of the rule of law. And it is actually for this reason that, also most of the panels today, but, the general discussion about nudging focus about what? The efficiency or output legitimacy of nudging. What I want to state here is that this is not always sufficient. It's not always sufficient. That a nudge works should not necessarily be perceived as, as a sufficient condition to acknowledge its legitimacy. We need to try and strengthen nudging in terms of the three elements of the rule of law that I mentioned before. One example in terms of formal legitimacy: never intervene. We're talking about mostly government units here, right? Without a legal basis. Right? This is necessary for any other intervention, like, for example, command control and incentives, but not that very much stressed in a discussion about nudging. And, it would be interesting to hear from Z to what extent, the behavioral insights team or other teams elsewhere in the world operate based on a legal basis always, right? And in fact, David Halpern has wrote in his book Inside the Nudge Unit, trying to, paint a picture that, nudges are opposed to legislation, right? Or, are not necessarily compatible, but this is something that, has been submitted. Fadi mentioned this yesterday and today as well. The nudges are not, incompatible. In fact, they complement command control. With regard to the substantive aspects of the rule of law, according to Thaler and Sunstein, the central objective of nudging is to influence choices of individuals in a way that will make choosers better off, that's the important part, as judged by themselves, right? They make a point on individual welfare. In fact, Cass Sunstein has written extensively on this. So there is a focus on freedom of choice and a judgment of individuals by themselves, right? So a focus on the freedom of choice and individual welfare. I am submitting that in terms of substantive legitimacy of nudging, this might not be sufficient. And this is something that the European Commission has been trying to promote in their policy documents, that, nudging should not only address individual welfare, but also public welfare, some general direction towards, a broader goal, let's put it like this. And thirdly, and most importantly, how can you improve the social legitimacy of nudging? Sometimes you may have to sacrifice efficiency for the sake of public participation and procedural justice. This is the part on, the contextualization between the rule of law and nudging. Would you like me to go into the examples, or I've exhausted my time?
That's excellent. Maybe if you can touch on your first example. I think one of your examples is from the European Union.
Yes, the European Union one, yes, of course. So I would like to present, if we're going to have the time, two examples. What I first want to make clear is that, in the European Union, nudging takes place at two levels. The European Union level, right, through regulatory instruments of the European Union, and at the domestic level. Sometimes the European Union legislation has an influence on the domestic aspect of nudging. Now, I'm going to present to you here, an example from Greece that is less known, and it's a behaviorally what the European Commission calls aligned initiative. Why? Because the Greek legislator or the Greek regulator, this is an example from Greece, when they introduced the nudge, they had no idea that, they were nudging. And this is a wonderful example of a nudge that is not behaviorally informed at all. In recent years, behavioral insights seem to be guiding efforts to tackle pervasive tax evasion in Greece. As that's a huge problem in the country, as traditional approaches have largely failed. So at the end of 2012, the Ministry of Development and Competitiveness, namely not the finance, the Ministry of Finance, introduced a market regulation that, in fact, does two things. First of all, introduces the no receipt, no pay rule. If the customer does not receive in a tavern, in a restaurant, in a cafe, when they're doing a purchase, a receipt, they have no obligation to pay. That's the easy part. Now, there is a nudge part to it. All all shops need to display both in their menus, when you're talking about cafeteria or a tavern or a restaurant, this message that you can see here, both in Greek and in English, and that's on the menu, and as a sign in visible places in the shops. Now, what the message says is that the consumer is not obliged to pay if the notice of payment is not received, and then in parentheses, receipt invoice. This could be a wonderful nudge, right? But first of all, nobody is measuring the effectiveness of the nudge as such, and the language that you can see here is not immediately clear to everybody. And I've asked people, that go as tourists in Greece, have you noticed the nudge? And I can tell for sure that the nudge is there. People generally have the tendency not to pay attention to it. Possibly a lot of words and no technical language. Shall I leave it to that?
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that example. And just kind of to look at, we're thinking also different levels of service delivery and different levels of government regulation. Z spoke a bit about local versus national. Now George has shared a great example from Greece. I wonder if you could take us even up a level to kind of the supranational. I think you had an example from the European Union as well, yeah?
Yes. Oh, I forgot to mention the following, namely the Greek regulators and legislators really liked the idea of displaying publicly messages, so now they're doing the same with POS card terminals. Yes. Now I want to present to you possibly the first nudge that has been introduced at the European Union level. It's, in fact, a nudge that is to be found in the European Union Consumer Rights Directive, Directive 2011-83, and this is really a behaviorally informed intervention in the sense that they have conducted studies before introducing this kind of nudge, and of course, this was all very well stated and documented knowledge in the behavioral circles, namely under Article 22 of the European Union Consumer Rights Directive, there is an article on additional payments. What are additional payments? For example, you want to purchase a ticket online, right? There is usually at the bottom a small message, do you want to add insurance to your purchase, right? And I remember myself, when purchasing tickets at the time, the box was pre-clicked, right? So you were defaulted into the insurance. The European Union legislator thought they had to intervene, and they did, in fact, Article 22 does, in fact, two things. You can read it if you wish. But, the first thing that does is that traders are not allowed to use defaults for additional payments. You cannot be defaulted into additional payments. Rather, there is an obligation under Article 22 of the European Union Consumer Rights Directive that the consumer should be making an active choice on additional payments. You actively have got to choose whether you want insurance or not, whether you want to speed up the process for a package delivery on Amazon.
Thank you very much for that example. So it's interesting for us to think not only how we can use behavioral insights to trigger action, but how also governments can think about being aware of these to maybe regulate more smartly about how we regulate different private sector actors if we think that these insights are perhaps being used for gains that maybe the society itself doesn't think should be properly allowed or should have some different structure to them. So I wonder if, Josh, if you could speak a little bit about how you've seen this spread to other countries around the world. We had a great question from the audience prior, talking about a lot of the examples of nudge units at least being located in the West, so to speak. But I know also Ideas 42, BIT, and others have done work in other countries. So I was wondering if you could share your experience, especially in government services in those other countries, and how you've seen the reaction as far as how new this felt to people versus how similar this felt to previous work. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, that was really loud. Great. I do just want to note before I start, I am in fervent hope that when the questions start, we'll get some good ones, especially from female members of the audience, because I don't see any females on our panel. But you know what? That's fine. We're going to persevere. So nudges are all around us, right? That's been a theme throughout the day. The question is, so I think that's actually a great question to start out with, right? So are nudges useful only for people in developing countries or developed countries, or is there something we can learn across contexts? And I throw this slide up there just to remind us all that no matter how educated or how aware or how learned we think we are in behavioral science, it's always going to be useful to have a little bit of support around us in the environment to prevent us from making the worst decisions that we could make. This is salient for me as someone, the father of a toddler, and hopefully resonates for you as well. Very different context now. So I spent a year living in Côte d'Ivoire, and about halfway through my time there, these billboards started to pop up. So for those of us who are not Francophone, this says, it took away my wife, okay? So does it say what took away my wife? No. Does anyone have any guesses for what might have taken away my wife? Shopping? Okay, I'm gonna ignore that one. Cell phone? No? Okay. Okay, maybe let's ignore this line of questioning for now. So it turns out that what took away my wife is corruption, okay? Now you might ask exactly how that works. I'm not sure I know the answer still, but basically what it says is that we have corrupted our institutions, it's ruined our country. And at the bottom it says corruption, we are all responsible, we are all victims. So this was a government campaign, obviously, to reduce corruption. Now let me ask you guys again, who does this presume the perpetrators of corruption are? Who is this targeted to? Citizens, okay? Who are usually the actors that engage in corruption? Governments. So hanging billboards by the side of the road is not likely to solve this problem, right? And ignoring for a second what the message is. So let me ask you now about what the message is. So what is this actually saying in some sense, this campaign? And by the way, this wasn't the only billboard they put around town. There were like tens of these, and they were all different messages. You know, one said it ruined my region, it destroyed my family, all these different things, right? So what is really being said here at some level? Any ideas? Shout stuff out. Bad. Anything else? Destructive. Affecting everyone, and so everyone is doing it, right? It's everywhere. So it's all around us. It's sort of unavoidable. So what do we know about social norms for those of us who are behavioralists in the audience? It makes it acceptable, and then not only that, it makes it salient for people, right? So if I'm a public servant and I happen to be driving by and seeing one of these billboards, the message that I'm taking home with me is that everyone around me is doing it, and on some level that makes me think that this is okay. So, do we think that this was successful in reducing corruption? No, of course no one evaluated it, so we'll never know. So corruption is everywhere. So this is just, I put this up there just as an example of how easy it is to get these sorts of things wrong, right? Even with the best of intentions. And so what I want to do is shift the focus from all the interventions that we've been talking about, all the solutions that have come up on each of these panels so far today, to the process that we use to come up with these interventions. Because if we just come up with the first thing that we think of, or the first thing we might have read, or the first thing that we see on one of Faisal's brilliant cards, we don't think about the process that we use to connect what we know about the context to what's likely to work, we're not going to do much. And so we at Ideas 42, we're an organization that uses behavioral science to create social impact in different places in the world. And we really live by this mantra that I have here from Albert Einstein, which is just that no matter what else you could be doing to come up with a solution, you better take the majority of the time and the majority of the effort that you put into it to define the problem. So think about who is the one that's doing the behaviors you want to change? What are those behaviors? When do they occur? Okay, and what is the connection between that behavior and the change that you ultimately want to see in the world? So I'm not going to go through this, but this is just to give you a flavor of how we think about this process. And I'm guessing many of you in the audience are thinking about how you want to take these ideas and use them in your own lives or use them in the lives of the people you serve. And I think you'd be well served by thinking about a methodology that allows you to come up with these interventions. And so the very first thing we do is define a problem. Then once you've figured out what the behavior is you want to change, you have to look at the context to figure out what about the context might be influencing that behavior using what you might have learned from this conference or from the literature on behavioral science. Then you design something not because you think it's cool, but because you think it specifically solves the contextual factors that influence that behavior. Right? And then critically, as many people have said, is we have to test whether those things work or not, because if we don't test them, we don't know and we don't learn, and we can't then create the next version of it. And so this is a very iterative and complicated process that we use. There's a lot of fine-tuning that's gone into developing these methods. And I encourage you to think about such a process and using it in your own work. But the key elements here, again, are beginning with the problem and proceeding very carefully and very deliberately using science toward a solution. So I could just give you a couple of examples. I think what I'll say instead is just that this has been applied, what I think is most relevant for this panel, not just on the behaviors of what you might think of as citizens or consumers, which are what most of the examples we've talked about are. So let's say saving money over time, or whether or not to pay receipts that you receive, or even something like paying taxes when you're prompted to by mail, but also to those of us who are in jobs that we are being paid to do, but yet could do them better. And what I mean by that in this context is government servants, so public servants who are, and I know there's been a lot of questions about that, specifically in the Lebanese context. What can we do to get government bureaucrats to behave in different ways? Well, it turns out that there are answers to that question that are emerging. So it's not as easy to study government bureaucrats, so there's less evidence available, but there are things that we're learning over time. And this is one example from health clinics in Nepal. So these are frontline health workers who are government employees. And the interesting thing about this intervention, without going into all the details, is just that it creates a comparison between clinics. So not between people, the way that you might do with a tax nudge or with an energy nudge or a water nudge, but between clinics. So at the collective level, suddenly employees within these institutions are looking across to other institutions that are like them and comparing their performance with those other institutions. And if you think about it, the theory is not obvious that that would work. So it's not obvious that people's tendency to compare themselves to others would aggregate to the collective level and make any difference in the way that institutions behave. But it turns out that that can work. And we don't know enough yet about how it works and when it works. But we do know that it does work. And in this case, it worked quite a lot. I think there's like a 17% increase in the provision of, or the offering of long-range contraceptive devices to women who are coming into these clinics. And so, you have quite a large increase in the behaviors of these healthcare workers, which ultimately will lead to much better outcomes. Oh, here we go. Actually, it's even bigger than I thought. It's 25% increase. How about that?
Thanks very much, Josh.
Yeah.
Super helpful. A round of applause for the three presentations. I'd really like to invite Hassan Mukhaber to share some reflections on what you heard, and maybe even share spaces that you've seen in your work where there's opportunities to apply behavioral insights to government service delivery within the context of Lebanon. If you'd like to share some reflections now.
Yes, thank you very much. It is with great interest that I'm sharing my thoughts and participating in this conference on nudge. I have worked in writing laws for the past 16 years. And I have worked as a lawyer. But also one of the fields that I was most fascinated by was legal philosophy, legal sociology. Now, we're getting into a field that has to do with psychology, behavioralism. And the issue that I'll pose is how can we benefit from nudges in legal enforcement? Because this is the real issue in Lebanon and for most lawmakers. How can you turn rules into a behavior of the people? That is, how to enforce the rules. One of the unfortunate facts in Lebanon is that most rules, many rules, are not enforced. To just give you an example, Parliament has recently established a standing committee to follow up on 24 laws that were voted but never enforced. And these were major bills that were voted. And I think that in the mind of a legislator, of an analyst, there is a problem there that is not only psychological or even sociological, but it goes to politics. And my bottom line, and if I were to write something about my intervention, I would speak of law enforcement in four major fundamental words. And you always think of laws with carrot and a stick. So I would add a third element, which is a nudge. We normally think of laws that would need sticks. We tend to forget that laws can be better enforced with carrots, with encouragements, and that a nudge is a special way to look at enforcement, which is novel, and needs to be factored in not only at the level of haphazard enforcement, but already factored in by the legislator itself and by the regulator itself, rather than leaving it to social and social actors such as yourselves and the nudge unit. So yes, I would say that I believe in the effectiveness of nudges, but I would use it as one of the tools for law enforcement, and that needs to be factored in by the legislator, by the regulator, already at inception. And I would give examples, if I may. My second thought has to do with the type of enforcement that are required by the types of rules that are set. Sometimes the easiest rules to enforce are the ones that say do not. Yeah, the rules that forbids you from a behavior, and the most difficult that invite you for positive behavior. And in most of us, for the ones that have studied law, these issues exist ever since humanity had started. And I'll give you one simple example. Remember the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments of God. The regulator was simply God, not anybody else. So God tells you not to kill, that's easy. Because if you kill, most societies would just go out and kill you. But remember that part of these 10 Commandments, there's a rule, honor your father and mother. And how do you enforce that? But that's a real question for rule enforcement. But if you go beyond and look at the type of laws that, going back from antiquity, from God to the modern legislator, to the modern regulator, we are into a complex network of rules. We live by very complex rules. Many of them are unwritten rules, that are those social rules. But surprisingly enough, these social rules in Lebanon are the ones that are best enforced. Because there are a set of nudges, systems, that you don't see. Like Monsieur Jourdain that was doing prose without realizing that he was doing prose. Society does create nudges and systems of enforcement that societies now that look at it very formally, with police and judges, the rule of honor your father and mother and others that are unstated and unwritten are the ones that are in Lebanon, the ones that are most well stuck to and well enforced. Because society has these amazing tools, and I think that the nudge field has to learn from sociology, not only from psychology, how do we enforce rules? Learn from society, how does it make that you honor your mother and father? And I think these are tricks for the field to learn from. Now going back to some more technical stuff, like the ones you've been dealing with, right? I think it has been touched upon, and a friend from Greece has given examples. One of the most basic problems of rules is that they're not necessarily known. There's a fascinating principle in law that no one is supposed to ignore the law. And it's very simple, because it covers up everything that the government is not doing, such as explaining what the laws are. And how do you explain thousands of laws and thousands of rules? It's impossible. So just knowing the rule is an issue. I take an example that I'll be using throughout my hopefully short intervention. The ban on smoking in public areas in Lebanon. Who remembers this law? Raise your hand. Who considers that it is enforced in any means? Who considers, well, there's one hand up. Yeah, two hands. Who consider that it is not? Yeah, great. Now, do you believe that when it was voted, it was better enforced than later? Who considered it was better enforced? Yeah. Who considered that something has happened in the middle that stopped it? Okay, I've got most of my answers. So if you just take that as an example, it does illustrate how a society, which is the same, it's the Lebanese society, that we can have our judgment about what the rule of law means in this country, because it has to do with it. One major difference between Lebanon and the Arab region and your examples from the UK and the US is that you have an established culture of rule of law. We do not. We have an established culture of the rule of social laws. These are the ones that are well established and well enforced. But when it comes to those other modern norms, technical norms, these are the ones that, surprisingly, come into an environment that does not respect laws. Rule of law, a law in this country is meant to be twisted. And if you don't, you're not bright enough. And some would dare and say that you're stupid if you just abide by the law. Law-abiding citizens are not a good value. So, and this touches upon not an issue of behavioralism, but of morals and of social norms. How can you turn, and I've read the whole book about how are people moral? It's impossible. It's important because those rules that are important, the things that tells you what to do, not only what not to do, these are extremely difficult to explain. How can a society is moral? Meaning, how does a society abide by the rules it sets? And it's impossible to put a policeman for every law. It's impossible to create a nudge for every practice. So how is it that we make that culture infused in society? A first answer, simple answer, is information. There is lack of information, and lack of information that can be understood and explained. And the assumption that if you publish a law in an official gazette, that doesn't mean much. There are many associations in Lebanon that have taken the relay of government, that have explained the laws, and when they were explained, they made sense and they were used. As an example, remember also the law that was voted to protect women from domestic violence. That law was very much in the media, and therefore it had created not only a need, but an incentive for women to claim for their rights. The problem is that when it was voted, it was smeared, because the campaign when it was voted, it was a bad law. It took several years later, when the law was explained, that women started using it. Women started using it only when they were convinced that it was good for them, and they understood how to use it. So the tool was simple. Information, because the assumption of a law, that's the first hurdle of the law. The second hurdle of the law is that we normally, legislators, only provide for sticks. We say that if you don't do something, you go to jail, you pay a fine, but this normally doesn't always work. It is useful to include in laws. We need to always think about ways to include not only sticks, but also carrots. In a recent bill, in fact, that was the last bill that I've submitted to Parliament, it was a bill on food waste. We have created two sets of incentives, negative incentives and positive incentives. Negative incentives, if you don't give food back to society, you are fined. And we added also positive tricks, positive incentives. If you do, then you get a cut on VAT. But we did not provide for a nudge, because there may be other tools in this law that has to do with changing people's behavior and how do they behave. Especially Lebanese eat a lot. You go into a restaurant, and the first thing that in a Lebanese restaurant you get a full table of meza, not necessarily to eat, but to enjoy looking at, and to show the people that you're also Kareem. Kareem, Lebanese are kurama. And karam al-thaqafi al-Lebanese. We are generous, and because we're generous, we litter food. This is a crazy culture. How do you change it? You normally go to Europe and you're served an entry. You serve a salad, a steak, a dessert, and you're out. In Lebanon, you have to have a table full of food, and you know that 90% goes to the garbage. So yes, it is tough. How can we work with restaurants? Because this issue of food waste is a big issue and will not be solved only by positive and negative incentives that are classical. So yes, we need this gamut of things. To enforce laws, we need sticks, we need carrots, but yes, we need nudges, and we need to learn how to do them, and we need the culture of law enforcement. We need the culture, and with these 4 tools, nudge is only a small piece of the puzzle. It is interesting, it is worthwhile, but let's not forget the full package. Let's not forget the hardcore things that sometimes we fail to do. And that other additional nice thing that is a nudge, well, I truly like, and I'm very happy to be with you at this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for fun. So I would like to request those with the mics to go around for anyone raise their hand with a question. And while we're waiting for the questions, I'd like the first question to be from a woman, if we may, since unfortunately we had a woman on the panel, but she couldn't make it because she came down with malaria. So she's in absentia. So, but I would like the three of you guys to reflect.
Is that the cost of
briefly.
being on the panel?
Apparently it's dangerous to be on my panels. I would like to hear some brief reflections from the 3 of you on what Hassan said about how nudge can play a role in these sorts of challenges. So feel free to pick it up.
But
Z,
none
go ahead.
of them was a woman.
Yeah, unfortunately. Z, go ahead while we're waiting for the question.
So I guess one reflection from our side, one of the things that's happening at the moment in the UK, which really picks up on what Hassan and George were saying, was around, we're really looking at behavioural insights on a project that looks at the future of regulation in the UK. And it's particularly timely given, as you would all no doubt be aware, the UK's decision around the membership of the European Union. So suddenly a whole bunch of laws come up for grabs at a particular timely moment. And the way that we're kind of looking at it is like, can you make laws and legislation more behaviourally informed? And this comes down to your point around smarter enforcement. And I think the 2 lenses that we're kind of looking at it from is, one, well, can we design regulation legislation in a way that actually gets people to do what we want them to do, engage in particular types of behaviour, really recognising these behavioural biases. And so you can't introduce legislation that forces people to eat healthier. You can't force people to do that. But what you can do is design legislation, for example, to go into the elements that lead into unhealthy behaviour. So things like in the UK is being introduced a sugar tax to help incentivise, for example, the consumption of sugary drinks. Other things are around restrictions potentially on advertising of junk food and directed at children at particular hours. So again, you're not forcing people to directly eat healthier, but you're regulating in ways that understand how humans sort of interact with consumption of food. And on the other side, I think this really picks up on what George's point was made previously, is can you design legislation to really understand where behavioural science is affecting us potentially in a negative way, where nudges are actually negatively affected. You gave the example of where defaults are used perhaps slightly malevolently in the commercial areas to get us to pay things that we otherwise would not want to. And so it's about designing regulations and legislations in a way that reflects, actually, we know this is how humans behave, that we know they have a choice to opt out, but because of the evidence supporting it, we're going to have to be smarter in how we regulate in order to protect consumers, particularly vulnerable consumers in ways. So I think just picking up on both your points is that it's about designing like smarter legislation informed by behavioural science. And I know David sometimes can be a bit caricaturous in like putting behavioural insights as an alternative, but I think largely the view of the team is that it's seen as a complement more than anything else.
Great, thanks. And we'll take a question and we'll get some other reflections on this point later. But the question from the lady here with the mic.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rida Husseini and I'm a counseling psychologist. I am representing Communication for Development. I just want to share a small experience just in response on how to change those social norms. I've been involved lately with UNICEF basically to be able to eliminate the violence against children with the government of Nigeria. So the government of Nigeria decided that we needed to address those social norms before we actually come up with a law to protect children. In my humble experience, what I saw during facilitating those workshops, Of course, the people, the attendees were partly from different governmental agencies, NGO, and citizens, basically. And this is what we decided that we needed to hear from them on what their thoughts were. In order for us to push them for critical thinking, for them to understand, okay, so maybe I should not beat my child in order for me to make him make of her or him an honest woman or man, rather than give the what do you call it, the alternative, to say, okay, well, if you think this is a problem, let's all work together within the community with every single person living in Nigeria in order for us to get there. And that was a vision by 2030 for it to be implemented in order for us to actually work bit by bit towards that. And I'm just wondering here, don't you think it would be a good idea for us to address social norms in Lebanon rather than just impose those laws?
No, I think it's a great question. So how can we maybe think about addressing social norms? Thank you very much for that. We'll take one more question, I think a little bit more in the front with the mic here in the yellow shirt. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to react to two of the panelists, so maybe I'll start with Mr. Martin. So the examples in Côte d'Ivoire, I found that very interesting, but I had a completely different reaction to the one you named. So to me, it looked like I don't know the context, but it looked like the government of Côte d'Ivoire was opening the conversation about corruption. I'm just thinking if in Lebanon they started putting posters about corruption, that would be very interesting. And the second thing I saw is that, you know, this took away my wife. They're trying to show consequences of corruption. So I see it as a very intriguing campaign. But the minute that they take the initiative to talk about corruption, I think that means something. And I'd like to know your opinion. And the second thing I wanted to react to Mr. Mukhaiber. So you spoke about incentives. In my field of work, which is public relations, we're constantly trying to educate and to show why it matters for you to do the change. What is the return on your effort? What is the return on investment on anything that you want to convey, from, you know, disciplining your kids because maybe you don't know different, or to, you know, throwing cigarettes on the ground. So why does it matter? I don't know if that factors into your work, like to kind of make it clear to somebody, why does it matter to do it?
Thank you very much for those questions. So I'll ask Josh to react first, and also you can touch upon this idea of like how we can use behavioral insights and information and incentives as well, if you like. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. So let me I'll get to your question, but let me actually start by saying something I wanted to say in reaction to Dr. Hassan's point, and I think it also touches on the first question about norms. So I just want to ask everybody to reflect. Dr. Hassan said something interesting about how we need a culture of rule of law, if I got that right. And I think you often hear that in different places. People say, even within organizations, they say, we have a culture of X, or we have a culture of Y. And I'd just like everyone to reflect for a second, what do we mean when we say that about culture? What are we actually saying? And I think as a behavioralist, what I would propose is that when you think about what creates a culture, what do we mean by culture? When we say the word culture, we're sort of referring almost implicitly to something which is unchangeable. Like it's this thing that we don't understand, that's sort of imposed upon us exogenously, that we have very little power over. But if we think about what culture really is, it's a set of things that we have the tools to figure out. So it's norms, it's habits, it's what we did yesterday is the same as what we do today, something we call status quo bias. There's lots of factors that go into this question of culture. And there is maybe a piece in it which is received or difficult to change or built into a society, but my proposition is that there's actually quite a lot of culture that we can do something about. And in the Nigeria case, you know, it's possible to create norms where they don't exist. It's very hard. Look at the work of Betsy Levy-Pollock, for example. She's done work in Nigeria on changing norms around violence and conflict. I think also gender-based violence as well, so that might be relevant for your work. But it's possible to do. It's difficult, but possible. And then in relevance to the Côte d'Ivoire case, so what I'm not saying is that it's wrong to start a conversation, and one can always debate what the best way of doing that is. What I'm simply saying is that for the context of that country and where they were at in their national conversation, and the way that they chose to start the conversation, I think there's a lot that we know from science that leads us to be skeptical of whether that's going to work. And what I'm not saying is that it's wrong to put, posters or billboards or something like that. In Lebanon, that may be very well a positive type of intervention, or at least a baseline type of foundation to build upon. But you really have, my point is you have to think very carefully about the context you're working in and define what the behaviors are that you want to work on. Corruption is not a behavior, right? Bribe taking is a behavior. Graft is a set of behaviors, right? Contract fraud is a behavior. And you have to think about what are those behaviors you're trying to work on, which matter for the country you're working in the context you're working in, for the people you're working with, and then back out from there what the intervention is that's going to be most likely to solve that.
Thanks. And then Hassan, if you could speak to that question as well.
Yes. Let me tell you what I mean by culture. It is not an overall theoretical thing of a whole society on everything. It is segmented, because I believe, as I had said, that there are rules in Lebanon that are very, very well respected, and these are the social norms that are well entrenched. For instance, you don't go out naked on the streets. These are simple, like social norms. And then you have those others that are new, established by political decision of a parliament or a government. What I'm saying that the culture in fields, in areas, in Lebanon, and I pretend to speak out of experience, the culture in Lebanon is the question that the citizen asks his or herself, how do I circumvent the rule? Not how do I enforce it. Being abiding, accepting a rule, a standard, a law, whatever you would call it, is something that I would call culture, because it's very broad, it's very well entrenched, and it is hard to change. You call it whatever you want. But this feeling of a society, and I think that when you take it as a starting point, when you take it as a fact, then you have to factor it into your law. And this is where culture makes a distinction or a difference between what happens in the UK and what happens in Lebanon. Because dealing with the same problem will have to be dealt with differently in rules that are set in Lebanon because of this culture and in others. There was a joke that I remember growing up with. You know that if you'd go from north to south, you'd have different ways that people will deal with public parks, with gardens, right? So if you'd go in the northern Europe, then you'd have these open parks with no boundaries, and they will be well kept and nobody will touch them. The further south you go, you start getting penalties, and you have the gardens that are all wired up, and you have guards on the entries. So this is what I mean by culture. What do you think? How does your society, how does our society look at rules that are imposed upon by a government? And it has to do also with the legitimacy of the government, with what George was explaining, with the level of participation, and how well defined is a solution that, did you participate, do you understand the value? And going back to your question, what's in it for me, was it sufficiently explained? So you sometimes need to create a culture around every issue, such as stopping smoke in public areas. There is a culture of smoke, and yes, it's so well entrenched that not dealing with it as part of your regulation would create a law that is born dead, as we did in Lebanon. So yes, there are cultures, if I may correct my term, there are cultures related to law enforcement, and these need to be taken as a basis for analysis and for enforcement.
Thank you very much for that. So just it sounds like we are saying different things, but maybe in a way we are agreeing, in the sense that we need to take into account many factors when we're structuring government services and government policies: the classical tools, incentives, disincentives, information provision, procedural justice, but also thinking about the culture, both as it's given, but also as it might be shifted by how we can shift those behaviors of public servants, but also people in society broadly. I'd like to get kind of the top-level highlight thoughts of the panelists just very quickly, 30 seconds each. I'll start with George, because I know you want to touch on something as well.
Well, I think, the buzzword that, could unite all those views that His Excellency made, Josh made, the audience made, is internalization, right? No, the difference between culture and any other types of, interventions or, concepts is that culture is something that is internalized, right? We do it because, it's in us. We believe we have got to do it. And this is something that, people that work in behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, have not really worked or embedded into their work. And possibly, there is space there for future work, towards improving policy making overall. So internalization, I believe that's an important word for us to keep.
No, I think I mostly said my piece. I would just say I think I would agree with you that we are actually in fierce agreement. And I'm sorry for pushing you on this, Dr. Hassan. I think it's useful just, as a behavioralist, we never take things as given. We're sort of an upstart discipline to begin with. And so I think, I just think it's useful, to think about, to try to translate a concept that seems as difficult to engage with as culture, and undoubtedly it is, certainly in a place like here, as you would all know much better than me. But I do think that there are some tools that we're given from this emerging discipline that allow us to do a few small things around the margins that may look in some way like culture change, but are actually changing norms and habits and behaviors that might look a little bit different. I mean, even something like, you spoke about social norms of tax. I mean, tax is a law, and certainly you wouldn't say that, in the UK there's a culture of, not paying your taxes. I mean, the UK is probably one of the most law-abiding societies one can find on planet Earth, right? And yet, reminding people that, simply just reminding people that their neighbors are paying taxes at a high rate is enough to encourage greater tax participation. So I just think there may be opportunities like that exist, even in societies where we think of the culture as being, one of the main barriers.
Definitely.
Very much.
Cultures
Josh, and then,
can change.
Yeah. And G, could you share your thoughts? Hassan will give you the last word.
No, I simply agree, because, behavioralism, whatever we're dealing with, enforcement of norms, there are two things. Sometimes we need to be humble, because sometimes it's not the people that are doing it wrong, it's the norms that are doing it wrong, right? So we need at least to be humble to look at who is wrong and who is right. And this is where I believe that there's a dialogue that has to happen. What's the best norm to establish and how to better enforce it? And sometimes you'd better do a halfway norm if it's better enforced than a top norm that is not. For instance, banning smoke in public spaces in Lebanon has been a big debate over how much of standards do we set, and would the people follow the standards that we're setting? Ultimately, they won. The people won over the law. So it's also a dialogue. How do you change behavior? And this has to be planned. And as I'm saying, yes, you can change behavior. Yes, you can change the culture. But again, this has to be planned. And the field is extremely interesting. And I've tried to conclude on it. And I would invite the field to use legal anthropology as a tool, because that's a discipline that I would love to see happen. How can you use Aborigines as examples rather than law-abiding United Kingdom citizens? How would Aborigines enforce their laws and their norms, and how can we learn from them? Truly, these are areas where cross-pollination of disciplines are interesting, including the one of behavioralism into legal enforcement.
Thank you very much, Hassan. And Z, if you could close us out with your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think just a final reflection on my side is just that in order to have this substantial change on culture, as we've all reflected on, sometimes it's not just about government doing it in and of itself and citizens. It requires different sorts of partnerships. And I think one of the examples I talked a little bit before about is the sugar tax being introduced in the UK. One of the things that we kind of recognise is that just by introducing the regulations around sugar, that's not that in and of itself isn't necessarily going to change consumption habits. And the things that we're quite encouraged by is that the private sector started to reach out going, well, particularly the soft drink producers have decided, well, actually, we can all reformulate in order for the products to have less sugar so that we don't have to pay that tax. So it's sort of this like public-private partnership coming to change a culture of consumption, a culture around a particular norm. And so in order to do that, I think that's probably the way that you have to look at a problem, this partnership model, in order to really solve some of these deeply entrenched issues, whether it's corruption, whether it's unhealthy eating, whatever it is, these sorts of partnerships are important.
Great, thanks so much everyone. Thanks to the panelists. We give them a round of applause.
Okay, thank you everyone. we have made a slight change to the schedule. So we now invite you all to the lunch reception that is held outside. And we will resume at 2:30 p.m. sharp with the last 3 panels about applying BI in education, applying BI to financial inclusion and social inclusion, and the future of behavioral economics and nudge in the region. Thank you.